All right, let's get started. Here we go. Chapter 3, British Commerce and the Triangular Trade. A. Triangular Trade. According to Adam Smith, the discovery of America and the Cape Route of India are, quote, the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. The importance of the discovery of America lay not in the precious metals it provided, but in the new and inexhaustible market it afforded for European commodities. One of its principal effects was to, quote, raise the mercantile system to a degree of splendor and glory which it could never otherwise have attained to. It gave rise to an enormous increase in world trade. The 17th and 18th centuries were the centuries of trade, as the 19th century was the century of production. For Britain, that trade was primarily the triangular trade. In 1718, William Wood said that the slave trade was, quote, the spring and parent whence the other flow. A few years later, I don't know how to say the rest of this person's name, describes the slave trade as, quote, the first principle and foundation of all the rest, the mainspring of the machine which sets every wheel in motion. In the triangular trade, England, France, and colonial America equally supplied the exports and the ships, African and human merchandise, the plantation and colonial raw material. The slave ships sailed from the home country with the cargo of manufactured goods. These were exchanged at a profit on the coast of Africa for black people, who were traded on the plantation at another profit in exchange for a cargo of colonial produce to be taken back to the home country. As the volume of trade increased, the triangular trade was supplemented but never supplanted by a direct trade between home country and the Caribbeans, exchanging home manufacturers directly for colonial produce. The triangular trade thereby gave a triple stimulus to the British industry. Black people were purchased with British manufacturers, transported to the plantation. They produced sugar, cotton, indigo, molasses, and other tropical products, the processing of which created new industries in England. While the maintenance of black people and their owners on the plantations provided another market for British industry, New England agriculture, and the Newfoundland fisheries. By 1750, there was hardly a trading or a manufacturing town in England which was not in some way connected with the triangular or direct colonial trade. The profits obtained provided one of the main streams of that accumulation of capital in England which financed the Industrial Revolution. The Caribbean islands became the hub of British Empire, of immense importance to the grandeur and prosperity of England. It was the black slaves who made these sugar colonies the most precious colonies ever recorded in the whole annuals of imperialism. To post, there were, quote, the fundamental prop and support of the colonies, valuable people whose labor supplied Britain with all plantation produce. The British Empire was, quote, a magnificent superstructure of American commerce, naval power on an African foundation. Sir Josiah, I think so, Child estimated that every Englishman in the West Indies, quote, with 10 black people that work with him according to what they eat, use, and wear, would make employment for men in England. By Devenant, like Devedance? Okay, never mind. I'll look. There's my phone. Figure out what that means.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
Looks like it's an institution. It's an institution according to this. Let's see, hold on a second. Yeah, computation of one person in the islands, white or black, was as profitable as 7 in England. Another writer considered that every family in the Caribbean gave employment to 5 seamen and many more artificers, manufacturers, and tradesmen, and that every white person in the islands brought in £10 annually, clear profit to England, 20 times as much as a similar person in the home country. William Wood reckoned that a profit of 7 shillings per head per annual was sufficient to enrich a country. Each white man in the colonies brought a profit of over £7. Sir Dabley Thomas went further. Every person employed on the sugar plantation was 130 times more valuable to England than one at home. Professor Pittman was estimated that in 1775 British Caribbean plantation presented the valuation of 50 million sterling. The sugar planters themselves put the figure at 70 million in 1788. In 1798, Pitt assessed the annual income of West Indigenous plantations at £4 million, was compared with 1 million from the rest of the world. As Adam Smith wrote, quote, "The profit of the sugar plantations in any of our Caribbean indigenous colonies are generally much greater than those of any other cultivation that is known either in Europe or America." According to the Devenant, Britain's total trade at the end of the 17th century brought in a profit of £2 million. Plantation trade accounted for £600,000. Re-export of plantation goods, £120,000. European, African, and Levant trade, £600,000. East India, which is not the Caribbeans, we were told, trade £500,000. Re-export of East Indian goods, £180,000. Sir Charles Whitworth in 1776 made a complete compilation from official records the import and exports trade of Great Britain for the years 1697 to 1773. His book was invaluable for an appreciation of the relative importance of the Caribbean and mainland colonies in the British Empire of the 18th century. In the year 1697, the indigenous colonies supplied 9% of British imports. The mainland colonies 8%. 4% of British exports went to the Caribbean, slightly under 4% to the mainland, and the Caribbean accounted for 7% of Britain's total trade, the mainland for 6%. In 1773, the Caribbeans still maintained their lead, though as an export market, they had become inferior to the mainland colonies, which their larger white population. In that year, nearly 1/4 of British imports came from all Caribbean areas, and 1/8 of the entire mainland. The Caribbean assumed somewhat over 8% of British exports, and mainland 16%. 15% of British total trade was with the Caribbeans, 14% with the mainland, taking the total for the year 1714 to 1773, and including in those total trades with new acquisitions, foreign colonies temporarily occupied by British forces during the war, or foreign colonies in general, we get the following picture. 1/5 of British imports came from the Caribbean, 1/9 of the mainland. 6% of British exports went to the Caribbean, 9% to the mainland, 12% to Britain's total foreign commerce was accounted by for by the Caribbean, 10% by the mainland. During these same years, 1.5% of British imports came from Africa, 2% to British exports went to Africa, while African trade represented nearly 1.5% of total British trade, leaving out of account, therefore, the plantation colonies on the mainland, Virginia, Maryland, Carolina, Georgia, and the triangular and Caribbean trades represented nearly 1/7 of the total of British trade during the year 1714 to 1773. The amazing value of these Caribbean colonies came more graphically be presented by comparing individual Caribbean islands with individual mainland colonies. In 1797, British imports from Barbados, five times the combined import from the bread colonies. The exports up to Barbados were slightly larger. Little Barbados, with its 166 square miles, was worth more to British capitalism than New England, New York, and Pennsylvania combined. In 1773, British imports from Jamaica were more than 5% and combined imports from the bread colonies. British exports to Jamaica were nearly 1/3 larger than those to New England, and only slightly less than those to New York or Pennsylvania combined. For the year 1714 and 1773, British imports from Montserrat were 3 times the import from Pennsylvania. Imports from Nevis were almost double those from New York. Imports from Antigua were over 3 times those from New England. Imports from Barbados were more than twice as large as those from the bread colonies. Imports from Jamaica, nearly 6 times as large. And from the same year, Jamaica as an export market was as valuable as New England. Barbados and Antigua combined meant as much as to British exporters as New York, Montserrat, and Nevis combined were a better market than Pennsylvania. British exports to Africa during these years were only 1/10 less of those to New England. British imports from Africa 1/4 more than those from New York and more than doubled from those from Pennsylvania. Mercantilists were enthusiastic. The triangular trade and the associated trade with the sugar islands, because of the navigation they encouraged, were more valuable to England than her mines or tin or coal. These were ideal colonies, but for them Britain would have no gold or silver except that she received from illicit commerce with the Spanish colonies and an unfavored balance of trade. Their tropical products, unlike those of the northern parts of the mainland, did not compete with those of the home country. They showed little sign in that industrial development which was the constant fear where the mainland was concerned. Their large black population was an effective guarantee against aspirations of independence. All combined to spell one word: sugar. The pleasure, glory, and grandeur of England, wrote Sir Dabney Thompson, has been advanced more by sugar than by any other commodity, wool not excepted. There was one qualification: monopoly. The economic philosophy of the age had no room for the open door. The colonial trade was a rigid monopoly of the home country. The mercantilists were adamant on this point. Colonies, wrote Davenant, it must be a person, are a strength to their mother kingdom, while they are under good discipline, while they are strictly made to observe the fundamental laws of their original country, and while they are kept dependent on it. But otherwise they were worse than members looped from the body politic, being indeed like offensive arms wrested from a nation to be turned against its as occasion shall serve, end quote. The colonies, in return for their prosperity, owed the mother country and post views gratitude and an indispensable duty, quote, to be immediately dependent on their original parents and to make their interests subservient hitherunto, end quote. It was on these ideas that the mercantile system was erected. Colonies were obliged to send their valuable products to England only use English ships. They could buy nothing but British unless the foreign commodities were first taken to England and sent as dutiful children. They were to work for the great glory of their parent. They were reduced to the state of permanent vassalage. I'm going to look at the word, just in case. The legal social relationship of medieval feudalism where the subordinate tenant, a vassalage, privileged loyalty, homage, and military service to the lord in exchange for protection and land, and confined solely to the exploitation of their agricultural resources. Not a nail, not a horseshoe, said Catham, could be manufactured, nor hats, nor iron, no refined sugar. In return for this, England made one concession. The colonial products were given a monopoly of the home market. Keystone of this mercantilist arch was the navigation laws. England measured designed for English ends. The navigation laws were aimed at the Dutch, the foster fathers, as Andrew calls them, of the earlier British colonies, who supplied credits, delivered goods, purchased colonial produce, and transported it to Europe at all more attractive rates than the British could offer in open market. The laws were aimed also at the Scotch and Irish, and Scotland's attempt to set up an independent African company arose great fears in England and was largely responsible for the Act of Union in 1707. The large islands, the sugar islands, protested against this monopoly of their trade. Those in 1840 were loudest in their opposition to free trade, were in 1660 the most fervent advocates of free trade. In 1666, the governor of Barbados begged, quote, leave to the plain with his majesty, for he is come to where it pinches. Free trade is the life of all colonies. Whoever he be that advised his majesty to restrain and tie up his colonies is more a merchant than a good subject, end quote. His successors repeated the warning. Ye must make their port a free port for all people to trade with them, that will come. The ordinary way that's taken from new plantation, I humbly conceive, is a little erroneous. My lord, the act for trade and navigation in England will certainly in time be the ruin of all his Matty's foreign plantations, end quote. The Lord of Trade decided to, quote, give him the chaqui for upholding this maximum of free trade, end quote. They censured him severely for, quote, these dangerous principles which he entertained contrary to the settled laws of the kingdom and the apparent advantage of it, end quote. Such subversive ideas could not possibly be tolerated in the age which Herd demands that the navigation laws be stretched to confine the provision for English-built ships to ships built of England timber and use English-made canvas, in which passed legislation that the dead be buried in English wool, and all servants and slaves on the plantations be made to wear English wool, to encourage England foremost industry. black people the most important export of Africa, and sugar the most important export of the Caribbean, were the principal commodities enumerated by the navigation law. But the Caribbean sugar plantations never accepted this limitation on their trade. Ultimately, in 1739, they were granted the modification of the navigation laws, but in so limited a form, and only to such poor foreign markets in Europe, south of Cape Finisterre, that its advantages were let me look at this word. Go away. UG, there it is.
Nugatory.
Nugatory, no real value, worthless or trivial. But even the concessions badly shorn through, though it was aroused the wrath of the English merchants. It would set a Liverpool petition before the measure became a law. Quote, be highly prejudicial in many instances to the interests of the manufacturers, to the trade and navigation of Great Britain in general, and of this port in particular, end quote. 100 years later, the same conflict was to be fought out more bitterly between monopoly and free trade, mercantilism and laissez-faire. The antagonists were the same, British traders and industrialists on the one hand, and Caribbean sugar planters on the other. But British capitalism, now all for monopoly, was then all for free trade. The Caribbean planters, on the other hand, forgot all their noble free trade sentiments and clung tenaciously to the principle of monopoly, which they had formerly condemned as making them, quote, the merchants of slaves. B. Shipping and shipbuilding. I don't know if I can give my cards out. It's not letting me. Let's see. It won't even let me. Oh. Hold on. Will it let me? Nope. Fucking TikTok's weird. This external trade naturally drew in its wake a tremendous development of shipping and shipbuilding. None the least of the advantage of the triangular trade was its contributions to the woolen walls of England. There was less distinction between the merchant ship and the man of war in those days than there is today. The long voyages was admirably nursery for the seamen and the merchantmen, invaluable aids to the Navy in time of war, and advocates to the slave trade argued that its abolition would annihilate the marine, but cutting off a great source of seamen. As one Liverpool slave trade wrote, quote, it is a matter of too much importance to this kingdom. Whenever it is abolished, the naval importance of this kingdom is abolished. With it, the moment our flag will gradually cease to rid triumphant on the sea, end quote. In 1678, the Commissioner of Customs reported that the plantation trade was one of the great nurseries of the shipping and seamen of England, and one of the greatest branches of its trade. Here again, the sugar colonies outdistanced the bread colonies. More English ships sailed to the sugar colonies than to all the mainland colonies combined. In 1690, the sugar colonies employed 114 ships of 13,600 tons and 1,203 seamen. The mainland colonies, 111 ships of 14,320 tons and 1,271 seamen. Between 1710 and 1714, 122,000 tons of British ships sailed to the Caribbeans, 112 tons to the mainland and the Caribbean's trade, in 1907 employed 1/10 of ships of British shipping engaged in foreign trade between 1709 and 1787. British ships engaged in foreign trade quadrupled. Ships clearly for Africa multiplied 12 times and the tonnage 11 times. Shipbuilding in England received a direct stimulus from the triangular trade. Vessels of a particular type were constructed for the slave trade, combining capacity with speed in an effort to reduce mortality. Many shipwrights in Liverpool were themselves slave traders. The outstanding firm was Baker and Dawson, one of the largest exporters of slaves to the Caribbean, and engaged after 1783 in a supply of slaves to the Spanish colonies. John Gorrell was one of the Liverpool members of the company in merchants trade to Africa. So was John Oakhill, one of Liverpool's most successful shipbuilders, who apparently he eschewed the slave trade, and a port whose prosperity was intimately connected with the slave trade. William Rathbone was a curiosity in his refusal to supply timber for the construction of vessels to be employed to the slave trade, in which half of Liverpool sailors were engaged. The shipping industry was divided, as industry is in general, in the question of the organization of the slave trade. Some sections favored the Royal African Company, others the free traders. But on the question of abolition, the industry presented a united front, argued that abolition would strike at the very root of Britain's naval and imperial supremacy. The first reaction of Liverpool to the Act of 1788 regulating the capacity of slavers was that it left 22 masters of slave ships, 47 mates, and 350 seamen unemployed, with their families and the tradesmen dependent more directly on the trade with Africa. In addition to the seamen, there were an ancillary trade: carpenters, printers, and boat builders, tradesmen and artisans connected with repairs, equipment, and lading, commissions, wage, dock duties, insurances, all depended partly on the ship trading to Africa. To supply the ships there were, in 1774, 14 roperies in Liverpool. There were few people in the town, it was claimed, who would not be affected directly or indirectly by abolition. The Sugar Islands made yet another contribution to the growth of shipping. The peculiar economy developed in the Caribbean concentrated on export crops, while food was imported. Most important of all the food supplies was fish, an article dear to the heart of every mercantilist, because it provided employment for ships and training of seamen. Laws were passed in England to encourage the consumption of fish. Friday and Saturday were set apart as Fish Day. Fish was an important item of the diet of the slaves on the plantation, and the English herring trade found its chief market as a sugar plantation. The Newfoundland fishery depended on to a considerable extent on the annual export of dried fish to the Caribbean. The refusal or, quote, poor John fish, quote, fit for no other consumption, end quote, a Caribbean tradition was thereby fostered. Imported salt cod was still today a normal and favored dish in all but the all well-to-do Caribbean families, where it is still, quote, fit for no other consumption. It is not known. The increase in shipping subjected the 18th century docks of England and to intolerable strain. The number of ships entered the port of London tripled between 1705 and 1795. The tonnage quadrupled exclusively of the smaller vessels engaged in the coastal trade, in coasting trades. The warehouse on the quads were inadequate for the imports. The coolers could not be discharged, and the price of coal rose enormously. Sugar was piled 6 or 8 hogsheads high on the quad, increasing the danger of fire and encouraging thefts. A great machine of organized crime was developed involving some 10,000 people. The total annual depredation at the docks were estimated at £500,000, half this sum from vessels from the Caribbean. The Caribbean merchants set themselves to grapple with the problem. They organized a special force of constable to cope with the thefts and set up a general register for laborers discharging Caribbean ships. They lobbied in Parliament and eventually secured an act authorizing the construction of Caribbean docks. For 21 years, they were given a monopoly of loading the unloading vessels engaged in the Caribbean trade. The first stone was laid in 1800, and the ceremony was followed by an elegant entertainment for the notables presents, at which one toast was appropriately drunk to the prosperity of the Caribbean colonies. The docks were publicly opened in 1802, the first ship being named after the Prime Minister, the second laden with 600 tons of sugar. C. The growth of Great British seaport towns. Who's in here? I wish I can't access those fucking coins for some reason. Right. The development of the triangular trade and of the shipping and shipbuilding led to the growth of a great seaport towns, Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow, occupied as seaports and trade centers. The position in the age of trade that Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield occupied later in the age of industry. It was said that in 1685 that there was scarcely a shopkeeper in Bristol who had not a venture on board some ship bound for Virginia or the Antilles. Even the persons talked of nothing but trade, and it was satirically alleged that Bristol freights were owned not by merchants but by mechanics. Custom duties rose from £10,000 in 1634 to £334,000 in 1785. Wharfage dues payable on every vessel about 6 tons doubled between 1745 and 1775. It was the slave and sugar trades which made Bristol the second city of England for the first 3 quarters of the 18th century. Quote, there is not, unquote, wrote a local annualist. Quote, a brick in the city, but what is cemented with the blood of a slave. Sumptuous masons, luxurious living, liveried menials were the produce of the wealth made from the suffering and groans of the slaves bought and sold by the Bristol merchants. In their childlike simplicity, they could not feel the inequity of the merchandise, but they could feel it lucrative. End quote. An analysis of a committee set up in 1789 to oppose the movement for abolition of the slave trade shows that among the members elected were 9 merchants at some time mayors of Bristol, 5 who were sheriffs, 7 who had been or were to be masters of the Society of Merchant Venturers. When Bristol was outstripped in the slave trade by Liverpool, it turned its attention from the triangular trade to to the direct sugar trade. Fewer Bristol ships sailed to Africa. More went direct to the Caribbean. In 1700, the port had 46 ships in the Caribbean trade. In 1787, there were 30 Bristol vessels engaged in the slave trade, 72 in the Caribbean trade. The former averaged 140 tons each, and later 240. In 1788, Bristol had as many ships in the trade to the Leeward Islands, and almost as many in the trade to Jamaica as in the trade in Africa, up to Africa. Nearly 1/3 of the tonnage which entered the more than 1/3 of that which sailed from the ports was engaged in the trade with the sugar colonies. And it was the amiable custom in Bristol to celebrate the arrival of the first sugar ship each year by a gift of wine at the expense of the fortunate owner. The Caribbean trade was worth to Bristol twice as much as all her other overseas commerce combined. As late as 1830, 5/8 of its trade was with the Caribbean, and it was said in 1833 that without the Caribbean trade, Bristol would be a fish port. Bristol had Caribbean societies of its own. The town council distributed municipal funds for the relief of disasters caused by fire in the sugar islands. It was customary for younger sons and junior members of the Caribbean firms to spend some years on the plantations before entering business at home. Bristol members of Parliament in the 18th century were frequently associated in one way or another with the sugar plantation, and so important did the island become to Bristol that for the first half of the 19th century, Bristol was always represented in Parliament by a Caribbean person. By a West Indigenous. Okay, they say West Indigenous. But I think it's Caribbean person. Yeah, a Bally, a Protherio, or a Miles. James Evan Bally exhorted his fellow citizens not to lay the axe at the root of their own prosperity by supporting the abolition of slavery in the islands. His own prosperity was also at stake. The compensation paid to the family for their ownership of numerous slaves in Trinidad, the British Guinea, exceeded £62,000. Bristol presented a determinate opposition to the equalization of the sugar duties, which gave the coup de grace to the Caribbean monopoly. Thereafter, Bristol's trade with the Caribbean island declined rapidly. In 1847, 40% of the port's tonnage was bound for the Caribbeans, and ships returned from the islands represented a mere 11%. In 1871, no ship left Bristol for Jamaica, and the inward tonnage from the islands constituted less than 2% of the arrivals. Bristol's trade with the island did not revive until the end of the 19th century, with the advent of the banana in the world market. That the Caribbean trade did for Bristol, the slave trade did for Liverpool. And in 1565, Liverpool had 138 householders. 7 streets only were inhabited. The port merchant marine amounted to 12 ships of 223 tons. Until the end of the 17th century, the only local event of importance was the siege of the town during the English Civil War. In collecting ship money, Stafford assessed Liverpool at £15. Bristol paid £2,000. The ship entering Liverpool increased. The shipping entering Liverpool increased 4.5 times between 1709 and 1771. The outward tonnage 6.5 times. The number of ships owned by the port multiplied 4 times during the same period, tonnage and sailors over 6 times. Custom receipts soared from the average of 51,000 pounds for the years 1750-1757 to 648,000 pounds in 1785. Dock duties increased to and a half times between 1752 to 1771. The population rose from 5,000 in 1700s to 34,000 in 1773. By 1770, Liverpool had become too famous a town in the trading world for Arthur Young to pass it by on his travels over England. The abolitionist Clarkson argued that the rise of Liverpool was due to a variety of causes, among which were the salt trade, the prestigious increase of the population of Lincolnshire, and the rapid and great extension of the manufacture of Manchester. This is particularly flagrant case of putting the cart before the horse. It was only the capital accumulation of Liverpool which called the population of Lincolnshire into existence and stimulated the manufacturers in Manchester. That capital accumulation came from the slave trade, whose importance was appreciated more by contemporaries than by later historians. It is a common saying that several of the principal streets in Liverpool had been marked out by the chains and the walls of the house cemented by the blood of the African slaves. And on the one street was nicknamed, they used the N-word, Black Row. The red brick customs house was blazoned with black heads, they used the N-word, with stories is told of an actor in the town who hissed by the audience for appearing before them, not for the first time, in a drunk condition, studied himself and declared with offended majesty, "I have not come here to be insulted, but by a set of wretches. Every brick in those infernal towns is cemented with an African's blood." It was estimated in 1790 that 138 ships which sailed from Liverpool to Africa represented a capital of over £1 million. Liverpool's own probable loss from the abolition of slavery, from the abolition of the slave trade, was then computed at over £7.5 million. Abolition, it was said, would ruin the town. It would destroy the foundation of its commerce and the first cause of its national industry and wealth. What vain pretense of liberty? It was asked in Liverpool, can infatuate people to run into so much, oh my gosh, I don't know this word. Let me look up this word. Oh, of course it's not going to. A lack of morale restraint. Pronunciation. I gotta watch a freaking video.
Anyway, I'm flexible, but not when it comes to bad app design.
Who likes dominoes?
You're looking at how to pronounce these words and more confusing vocabulary and names. Many get wrong in English. Stay tuned to the channel to learn more. How do you say it? Licentiousness.
Licentiousness. Licentiousness. Okay, good. As to assert a trade is unlawful, which custom immemorial and various acts of parliament have ratified the given a sanction to. This dependence on the slave trade has proved very awkward to sensitive and patriotic historians. A generation argued, a Bristol historian in 1939, which has seen the spoliation of Ethiopia and the brutal dismemberment of China and the grape of Czechoslovakia, cannot afford to condemn the slave trade. In the opinion of the Liverpool town clerk, Liverpool was born more than its shares of the stigma it attaching to the slave trade. The indomitable perseverance and energy of its people would have assured an equal prosperity in the other direction, as effectively, if not as quickly, had the slave trade not existed. The ultimate success of the port would perhaps have been slowed down, though no prejudiced or impaired, without the slave trade. According to yet another Liverpool writer, there was nothing derogatory in the fact that their ancestors had dealt in, quote, inwards with the ER, and the horrors of the slave trade were exceeded by the horrors of the Liverpool drink traffic. But after all, quote, it was the capital made in the African slave trade that built some of our docks. It was the price of human flesh and blood that gave us a start, end quote. Some of those who made their fortunes out of the slave trade had softened hearts under their waistcoats for the poor of Liverpool, while the profits from slave trading represented an influx of wealth which perhaps no consideration would induce a commercial community to relinquish. Excuse me, sorry. Not until the Act of Union of 1707 was Scotland allowed to participate in colonial trade. That permission by Glasgow on the map. The sugar tobacco underlay the prosperity of the town of the 18th century. Colonial commerce stimulated the growth in new industries, as Bishop Pecco wrote in 1760 after the visit to Glasgow. The city was above all others felt the advantages of the Union by the Caribbean trade, which they enjoyed, which is very great, especially in tobacco, indigos, and sugar. Sugar refining continues as a important industry in the Clyde Valley until the ellipse of the Caribbean islands in the middle of the 19th century. D. The goods in the triangular trade. It is necessary now to hold on. Let me find out something. I want to look at something. Okay, long way to go. Okay, cool. 81. 81. All right. It is necessary to trace the industrial development of England, which was stimulated directly and indirectly by the goods for the triangular trade and the processing of colonial produce. The widespread ramification of the slave trade in English industry are illustrated by this cargo of Africa for the year 1787. Cotton and linen goods, silk, handkerchiefs, coarse blue and red woolen clothes, scarlet cloth in grain, coarse and fine hats, Worsted caps, guns, powder, shots, sabers, lead bars, iron bars, heater basins, copper kettles and pans, iron pots, hardware and various kinds, earthen and glassware, hair and gilded leather trunks, beads of various kinds, silver and gold, rings and ornaments, paper, coarse and fine checks, linen ruffed shirts and caps, British and foreign spirits and tobacco. The sundry assortment was typical of the slave traders' cargo, finery for African households, utensil clothes of all kinds, iron and other metals, together with guns, handcuffs, and fetters. The production of these stimulated capitalism, provided employment for British labor, and brought great profits to England. 1. Wool. Until the tremendous developments of cotton industry, the Industrial Revolution, wool was a spoiled child in English manufacturing, and figured largely in all considerations affected the slave trade in the centuries after 1680. The cargo of the slave ships was incomplete without some woolen manufactured surges, says perpetuosos. These are weird. Arangos and bays. Sometimes the cloth was called after the locality where it was first manufactured. Bridgewater's represents Bridgewater's interest in the colonial market. Welsh Plains, a woolen cloth, and the simplest weave was manufactured in Western England and Wales. Parliamentary Committee of 1695 voiced the public sentiment that the trade to Africa was an encouragement to the woolen manufacture. Among the arguments put forward to prove the importance of slave trade, the exports of wool, which the trade encouraged, were always given first place. A pamphlet in 1680 illustrating the public utility and advantages of African trade begins with, quotes, the exportation of our native woolen and other manufacturers is in great abundance, most of which were imported formerly out of Holland, whereby the wool of this nation is much more consumed and spent than formerly, and many thousands of poor people employed. Similarly, the Royal African Company stated in a petition in 1696 that the slave trade should be supported by England because the exports it encouraged of woolen and other English manufacturers. The woolen manufacturers of the kingdom took a prominent part in the long and bitter controversy waged between the Royal African Company and the separate traders. Those from whom the company made its purchases argued that the interlopers caused disturbances and dislocations of the trade, and that the trade declined when the company monopoly was modified. In 1694, the clothers of Whitney petitioned Parliament in favor of the company's monopoly. Cloth workers of Shrewsbury followed suit in 1696, and the weavers of Kidderminster twice in the same year. In 1709, the weaver of Exeter and woolen tradesmen of London, and in 1713, several tradesmen interested in woolen manufacture also took the company's side. But the weight of the woolen interest was on the whole thrown on the side of the free traders. The company's monopoly enabled it to, quote, screw up the tradesmen to a limited quantity, and price length, breadth, and weight. Monopoly meant one buyer and one seller only. The searchers in the custom house testified that when the trade was open, there was a great exportation of wool. According to the testimony of two London merchants in 1693, the monopoly was reduced. The export of wool was nearly 1/3. Suffolk exported 25,000 woolen cloth a year. 2 years after the incorporation of the company, the number declined to 500. In 1690, the clothers of Suffolk and Essex and the manufacturers of Exeter petitioned against the company's monopoly. Exeter petitioned again in 1694 and 1696, in 1709, 1710, and 1711 in favor of free trade. The woolen merchants of the kingdom complained in 1794 that restrictions had greatly lessened their sales. Similar petitions were presented against the monopoly by the woolen traders of London and the woolen merchants of Plymouth in 1710, the woolen dealers of Totnes and Ashburton, the woolen manufacturers in Kidderminster, and merchant adventurers in Maidenhead engaged in the woolen manufacture in 1711. Other petitions of Parliament emphasized the importance of the colonial market for the woolen industry. In 1690, the planters of Jamaica protested against the company's monopoly as a discouragement to trade, especially the woolen trade. A petition from Manchester in 1704 revealed that English wool was traded to Holland, Hamburg, and East for linen, yams, and flax, which when manufactured were sent to the plantations. The merchants and traders of Liverpool of 1709, the merchants and inhabitants of Liverpool in 1715, contended that the company monopoly was detrimental to woolen industry. Petitions from the Industrial North in 1735 enclosed that Wakefield, Halifax, Burnley, Cologne, and Kendal were all interested in the manufacture of woolen goods for Africa and the West and the Caribbean. That woolen goods should figure so prominently in tropical markets is to be attributed to the deliberate policy of mercantilist England. It was argued in 1732 on behalf of the mainland colonies, that Pennsylvania alone consumed more woolen exports from England than all the sugar islands combined, and New York more than any sugar island except Jamaica. Woolen goods were more suited for these colder climates, and the Barbadian planters preferred light calicos, which could be easily washed. But wool was England's staple. The climatic considerations were too great a refinement for the mercantilist mind. Anyone familiar with British Caribbean society today will appreciate the strength of the traditions thereby fostered. Woolen undergarments are still common in the island today, though more among the older generations, and suit of blue serge are still a sign of a well-dressed man, like the Englishman and unlike the North American in the colonies of the Caribbean. Middle-class, people of color, middle class today still apes the fashion of the home country in its preference for the heavier materials, which are so ridiculous and uncomfortable in a tropical environment. But cotton later superseded wool in the colonial markets, and it did in domestics. Of the total exports of 4 million pounds of woolen manufacturers in 1772, less than 3% went to the Caribbean and less than 4% to Africa. The best customer were Europe and America. In 1783, the woolen industry was slowly beginning to belated imitation and the technological changes which had revolutionized the cotton industry in its progress after 1783. The triangular trade and Caribbean markets played no appreciable part. 2. Cotton manufacture. What the building of ships for transport of slaves did for 18th century Liverpool, the manufacturing of cotton goods for the purchase of slaves did for the 18th century Manchester. The first stimulus of the growth of Cottonopolis came from the African and Caribbean markets. The growth of Manchester was intimately associated with the growth of Liverpool, its outlets of the sea and world market. The capital accumulated by Liverpool from the slave trade poured into the hinterland to fertilize the energies of Manchester. Manchester goods for Africa were taken to the coast. The Liverpool slave vessels, Lancashire's foreign market meant chiefly the Caribbean plantations in Africa. The export trade was 14,000 pounds in 1739. In 1759, it had increased nearly 8 times. In 1779, it was 303,000 pounds. Up to 1770, 1/3 of this export went to the slave coast, 1/2 to the American and Caribbean colonies. It was this tremendous independence on the triangular trade that made Manchester. Light woolen goods were popular on the slave coast, so were silk, provided they were goodly and had large flowers. Godly. But the most popular of all materials was cotton goods. As the African was already accustomed to coarse blue and white cotton clothes and his own manufacture. And from the beginning, the stripped loincloths, called anabasses, were a regular feature of every slave trader's cargo. Indigenous textiles, banned in England, soon established a monopoly of the African market. Rawls, Tapsels, Niceans, Canantians, Buckshaws, Nilas, Salempors. These indigenous clothes were highly prized, and yet another powerful vested interest was drawn into the orbit of the slave trade. Manchester tried to compete with the West Indian Company. Hafts, for example, were cheap. Cotton fabrics from the East later copied in England for the African market, but the backwardness of the English dyeing process made it impossible for Manchester to get the fast red, green, and yellow colors popular on the coast. Manchester proved unable to imitate the colors of these indigenous cottons. I think they're from India. And there is evidence to show that the French cotton manufacturers in Normandy were equally unsuccessful in learning the secrets of the East. Manchester was more fortunate in its trade in cotton than in linen checks. The figures for first half of the 18th centuries are unreliable. The European and colonial wars of 1739 and 1748, and the reorganization in which the African company was undergoing up to 1750, caused a slump in the cotton trade to Africa. And when it revived after 1750, indigenous exports were inadequate to satisfy the demands. English manufacturers made full use of this opportunity to push their own goods. In 1752, the exports of cotton linen checked alone from England was 57,000 pounds. In 1763, at the end of the 7-Year War, it stood at the exceptionally high figure of 302,000 pounds. But after 1767, remained between 100,000 pounds and 200,000 pounds. These people from India and Indian competition proved formidable. Available statistics make comparison between the value of English cotton checks and Indian cotton pieces exported to Africa impossible, as the former are given by value and the latter by quantity. But the growth of indigenous and English cotton exports to Africa will give some indication of the importance of the African market. Total cotton exports stood at 214,600 pounds in 1751, and in 1763 there were more than double. In 1772 there were more than 4 times as great. But as a result of the American Revolution, they declined to 195,900 pounds in 1780. The effect of the war on the slave and plantation market is at once apparent. By 1780, checks had ceased to be important part of the cotton industry. But it was not the war alone that was to be blamed. Manchester could satisfy the African market only when indigenous cotton was scarce or dear. For the plantation market, the cheapness was essential, and by 1780, raw cotton was becoming increasingly expensive as the supply lagged behind the demand of the new inventions. But according to estimates given to the Privy Council of 1788, Manchester exported annually to Africa goods worth 200,000 pounds, 180,000 pounds of this for black peoples only. The manufacture of these goods represented an investment of 300,000 pounds and gave employment to 180,000 men, women, and children. The French manufacturers, impressed with the quality of cheapness of those special goods called guinea clothes produced in Manchester's, were sending agents over to get particulars and extend open offers to Manchester's manufacturers. Should Britain abolish the slave trade to set up the ruin where they would be given every encouragement? In addition, Manchester in 1788 furnished for the Caribbean trade more than 300,000 pounds annually in manufactures, which gave employment to many thousands. Between the cotton manufacturers and Manchester, the slave traders there were not the close connection that have already been noticed to the case of the shipbuilders of Liverpool. But two exceptional instances of such connections exist. Two well-known cotton manufacturers in Lancashire, Sir William, can't say his last name, and Samuel Touchett, were both members of the Company of Merchant Trading to Africa. I can't say this person's name. It's Frasrickery, a London dealer in fustens, presented the case of the separate traders of Bristol and Liverpool against the African Trade Company in 1726. Touchett, a member of the Great Manchester Checkmaking House, represented Liverpool on the governing body of the company during the period of 1753 to 1756. He was concerned in the equipping of the expedition, which captured Senegal in 1758, and tried hard to get a contract for victualling the troops. A patron of Paul's unsuccessful spinning machine intended to revolutionize the cotton industry, accused openly of attempting to monopolize the import of raw cotton. Couch aided to his many interests a partnership with his brother in about 20 ships in the Caribbean trade. Touchett died, leaving a large fortune, and was described in his obituary notice as, quote, the most considerable merchant and manufacturer in Manchester, remarkable for great abilities and strict integrity, and for universal benevolence and usefulness to mankind. Two modern writers have left us with this description of the man: Lucullus, like soaring too high. He emerges as, quote, the first considerable financier that the Manchester trade produced, and certainly was one of the earliest case of the Manchester man, who was concerned at once in manufacturing and in large-scale financial and commercial ventures in the city and abroad. Other cases emphasize the significance of Touchett's careers. Robert Digges, I can't say his name, African slave trader of Liverpool, was the son of a Manchester linen draper and brother of another. In 1747, the Manchester man was a partnership with two Liverpool men on the voyage to Jamaica. A leading Manchester firm, Hilbert's, owned sugar plantations in Jamaica, and at one time supplied checks and imitations of indigenous goods to the African company for the slave trade. Pretty sure it's people from India. Manchester received a double stimulus for the colonial trade. If it had supplied the goods needed on the slave coast on the plantations, its manufacturers depended in turn on the supply of raw materials. Manchester's interest in the islands was twofold. The raw materials came to England in the 7th and 18th centuries, chiefly from two sources, the Levant and the Caribbean. In the 18th century, that Indian competition, which proved to be formidable for the Manchesters on the slave coast, and which was threatening to swamp even the home market with Indian goods, was effectively smashed, as far as England was concerned, by the prohibitive duties of Indian imports into England. The first step was thereby taken by which the motherland of cotton became, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the chief market of Lancashire. In the 18th century, the measure gave Manchester a monopoly of the home market, and private Indian trading began to import the raw cotton for Lancaster factories. A competitor of the Caribbean islands had arisen, to be followed later by Brazil, whose product by 1783 was recognized as clearly the superior of all the other varieties. Capitalism is the best, always will be. Great. That's great. It's great. Glad you can say things. But the earlier 18th century, England depended on the Caribbean islands, where between 2/3 and 3/3 of its raw cotton. Cotton, nevertheless, was essentially a secondary consideration in the Caribbean island planters' outlook. And however, much of the planters as a body looked with jealousy in its cultivation in India, in Africa, or Brazil. It remained a secondary consideration. In imposing the retention of Guadeloupe in 1763, the Caribbean interests measured their arguments in terms of sugar, while significantly the contemporary pamphleteers pointed to its cotton exports to England as a reason for keeping the island. But British consumption was small and Caribbean contribution welcome. In 1764, British imports of raw cotton amount to nearly 4 million pounds, and Caribbean supplied one half. In 1780, Britain imported more than 6.5 million pounds. The Caribbean supplied it 2/3. In 1783, the Caribbeans therefore still dominated the cotton trade. But a new day was drawing in the phenomenal expansion of an industry which was to clothe the world. A few tiny islands in the Caribbean could hardly hope to supply the necessary raw material. Their cotton was long, stapled, sea island variety, easily cleaned by hand, limited to certain areas, and therefore expensive. When the cotton gin permitted the cultivation of the short staple cotton by facilitating the task of cleaning, the center of gravity shifted from the islands to the mainland to meet the enormous demands of the new machinery in England. In 1784, shipment of American cotton was seized by the Liverpool custom authorities on the ground that cotton, not being a bona fide product of the United States, could not legally be transported to England in American vessels. It was an evil omen of the Caribbean islands, conceding as it did with another significant development. During the American Revolution, Manchester cotton exports to Europe almost tripled. The revolution itself created another important market for Manchester, an independent United States at the time when the cotton gin was just around the corner. For both, it was its import and export markets. Therefore, cotton was beginning to reach out to the world market. The sunny Caribbean skies was married by the barley perceptible but portentous clouds, and the gentle Caribbean breeze was rising ominously. It heralded the approaching political hurricane, which, to alter Edmund Burke's description of those vestations of nature common to the Caribbean, humbled the sugar planter's pride if it did not correct his vices. And let me see here. I'm going to see how long this next one is. 87. I'm going to put a bookmark on 87 just to see. Yeah, the bookmark just for right now. So I don't want to start this. If it's another long one, I'm going to stop here. Yeah, I might. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. They're going to go over every single product in the colonial entities. Now, the next product will be. Let me get back to it. And my reading is starting to decline a little bit. 87. We're going to stop here where it says 3, sugar refining. We went over the wool. We figured out how wool was good, and then it got outed by cotton. And now we saw how big cotton was compared to sugar within those Caribbean islands. And now we're going to talk about number 3, sugar refining. And we'll do that tomorrow. So we'll do that tomorrow. And I think Joe probably fell asleep, I'm guessing. So Joe fell asleep. All right, everybody. I appreciate everybody, whoever listened, whoever wanted to stay and listen. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.